Love this podcast? Support this show through the Acast supporter feature. It's up to you how much you give, and there's no regular commitment. Just hit the link in the show description to support now.
You're listening to Griefcast with me, Carrie-Ad Lloyd. Griefcast is a place to talk, share and laugh about the peculiar human process of death and grief. Each week I talk to a different person about their experiences of grief and death as we remember someone that they have lost along the way, whether it was a long time ago or you've just joined the club. Welcome to Griefcast. Hey Griefsters, I hope you're having an okay week. I left the house today and there was just people everywhere. It was really weird. It's like men queuing outside barbers. And then I live quite near a busy road. There was people like eating carbonara on the side of a road, so desperate they were to have a meal outside, not cooked by them. But it's, at least the sun is shining. Wherever you are, I hope you're having an okay week. This week's guest is the brilliant Jay Rayner. I don't quite know how to introduce Jay because he does so many things, but I'm sure you'll recognise him. He is a guest on MasterChef, he is a food critic, he's a journalist, he's an author, he's a broadcaster. He has his own podcast called Out to Lunch as well, where he interviews celebrities each week. They have a meal, and they've even been having takeaways during COVID. And he's, an incredibly witty, intelligent man. I felt very lucky that he gave up his time to come and speak to me. Jay came to talk to me about his friend David, who died in a mountaineering accident when he was just a teenager. People may know you from Kitchen Cabinet, which is, I love Kitchen Cabinet so much. But also, of course, you've moved into the world of podcasting, and you now do it's just sort of a chat over food, isn't it, really? But it's more than that.
The idea is so simple that when it was first put to me by the boss of the production company I produce it with, I kind of went, really? Which was... take a famous person out to lunch in a restaurant and chat to them.
Yeah.
And I suppose what I didn't quite clock was just how compelling that would be. We control the environment. So obviously in lockdown and COVID, who knows where we are at the point when people are listening to this.
Yeah.
But we've been doing it via Zoom and sending takeaways. But the majority still have been in restaurants. And
so is that how you're doing? You're sending them a takeaway and you get the same takeaway? Or
yes,
same restaurant?
Generally, sometimes.
Oh, nice.
Sometimes they've been slightly different, or they've had this Turkish and I've had that Turkish.
Okay, yeah.
Some of them have been absolutely extraordinarily fabulous. Anybody who listens to the Sophie Ellis-Bextor episode will hear her being thrilled by a man standing outside her house shucking oysters in the back of his car so they can be delivered in. Thank you, Bob's Lobster. We are dependent on the kindness of restaurants who we plug to the skies. But when we do them in restaurants, we tend to do it in a private dining room because we can control the sound environment. We put 2 microphones up, one over each head, and then there's 2 producers at the far end. And then we just treat it, and we always say to the waiters, whoever's the maitre d', whatever, just treat us as normal diners and take us through the whole thing. And what we discovered, in fact, we pretty much discovered it with the pilot, which was with Richard E. Grant, who was fabulous. That the food distracts from the externals. So they forget about the microphones and they forget about the producers and they just start to talk. And we have talked about lots of things. We've talked about death. Kathy Burke talking about her old mum dying when she was a kid. I'm pretty sure Richard talked about his father being gone and so forth. And they seem to find the presence of food and also the rituals of the restaurant compelling. It draws them in. Plus, of course, I'm an absolutely staggeringly brilliant interviewer, so it all comes together.
It all adds up. Yeah,
it all adds up.
I listened to the Grace and Perry one, and I found it really interesting because it totally you feel like you're eavesdropping at a restaurant. So when you and your restaurant partner are like sort of quiet, and then you tune into this really good conversation, and both of you are like, "Don't talk to me. This is too good."
Well, that's what I want it to be. There is an ideal kind of guest. Doesn't mean the others that aren't this don't work, but the ideal guest is one I have some knowledge of, or some interaction with, and ideally someone who's been through therapy. Those who have been through therapy have a language of disclosure, and they fall into it actually very, very quickly. And Grayson ticked both boxes.
Yeah, I thought the way you
had met before.
Yeah, the way you spoke to each other was really. Yeah, it sounded really matey in a way I felt like I hadn't heard him talk before.
I'm fascinated by disclosure. I want people to tell me their stories, and I think restaurant tables are the most fabulous place to hear those stories.
It's a shame that more like when you do go to therapy, you can't sit there and have food. Like they make you just sit in a sort of like dull beige room. It'd be quite nice to have oysters served.
I have to say, I've been quite clear. I've only ever had 1 hour of therapy in my life. It was with Susie Orbach, so I felt a little bit starfuckery there. But I'd kind of worked out what the issue was at the point when I which was actually to do with how to deal with. It was a point when I was developing a public profile in the age of online. People will tell you what they think of you, and I started responding to it. And I'd worked out that the issue was not reading abuse; it was putting your fingers to the keyboard to compose a reply. But I quite enjoyed my hour of talking about myself, and think, when I've got some time, I might do a bit more of that. But then I could just talk to you, which is what this is.
That's what podcasts have become, isn't it?
But they are. I mean, actually, but they are.
They are.
You and I. One of the things I've discovered doing out to lunch in lockdown is there is an intimacy to Zoom. We don't know each other. We've never met.
Nope.
But you're about to ask me some extremely personal questions, and because of the convention of Zoom and the podcast, I'm going to answer them.
I feel really awkward about doing it now, but I am going to do that, Jay. I feel like when you've sort of pointed out what a doctor's about to do, and they're like, "Oh, I mean, I was, but I'm not sure I should."
I'll take the rubber glove off then.
Yeah. But yes, I am going to do that, and I'm very appreciative that you're hopefully going to answer those questions. So, Jay, who are we remembering today?
We are remembering a friend of mine from, well, I was going to say childhood. It's adolescence. His name was David. I'm only going to give his first name.
Sure,
more out of respect for I think his sister, and I'm not sure if his parents are still with us, because David would have been literally the same age as me. I'm 54, and at that point is when you start mislaying your parents. We were mates. In reality, I look back and think, not that long, maybe 4 years, but that's an ocean of time when you're a teenager.
Yeah, that's a firm friend by that age, isn't it?
And he died in a mountaineering accident in 1983.
Wow.
In February 1983. He would have been 16. He was a fabulous person. I have very, very strong memories of him. But I also, when you asked me to do this, I mean, it sounds sort of, the hierarchy of grief, which I'm sure you've talked about before.
We always say that, there isn't one. There isn't one.
No, there isn't one. I could have talked about my parents, and maybe at some point we will. But then that is a natural part of growing older. I lost my parents when both of them had finally gone when I was 47. Which feels about right. But there is nothing natural about losing a childhood friend. Nothing at all. And
was it your first big loss as well? Was it the first time you really encountered, people can die?
Pretty much only, yes, because I didn't like my paternal grandparents, and was quite happy when I heard they'd gone, because they clearly didn't make my father happy. I'm sorry, that's absolutely true. Really, that's absolutely
You're not the first person to be. That's
so when they went, it was fine. Okay, well,
Yeah.
that's that issue dealt with. No, David was definitely very much the first experience of death and grief in any way. And there is an element. I am a parent. I have a 21-year-old and a 17-year-old. So my youngest is older now than David was when he died. And as a father, one tends to think of your own children as children, a statement of the obvious. But I have extremely adult memories of what went on around David dying in a mountaineering accident in 1983, the impact that had upon me, the depth of my emotional responses to it, my experiences of it, and the way we all dealt with it as friends. Because one of the things that really struck me is, I'm pretty sure at the time, none of us had any therapy whatsoever. None of us.
Yeah.
I wasn't on the mountaineering trip. Some of my very close friends were with him.
Oh, wow.
Maybe I should just tell you the story.
Yeah, sure. So what happened?
I'm going to go back a bit. we met on a Jewish youth group tour of, I want to say Europe, maybe in Israel. Both not observant Jews at all. I think his family may have been a bit more observant than mine were, which wasn't hard because mine were completely non-observant. And we became very, very close friends. We were linked by a particular like of music. I played synthesizers, he played bass. We got stoned together a bit. I thought he was hilariously funny. I went to this will all become relevant. I went to one particular public school in northwest London. Smell my privilege, called Haberdashers' School for Boys.
I was just about to say Haberdashers. I'm from North London. I was just about to say Haberdashers. Yeah.
Along with all those bloody comedians, David Deal and Sacha Baron Cohen and all of that, although he was younger than me. But I never had much of a social life with the people I went to school with. I felt sort of excluded and on the outside. I had quite a big Jewish circle because of Jewish holidays, and then I'd met this guy, Dave, and he went to another school, a public school, a very well-known one called University College School, UCS, on Frognal. Pretty much attended by the denizens of the liberal intelligentsia in Hampstead and Highgate. They also had a sister school, South Hampstead, which was, most of the pupils there were young women who would have a copy of Simone de Beauvoir in their back pocket. These kids were nothing like anything I knew from haberdashers. They seemed exotic in a certain way and thrilling, and they were beautiful as well. I do remember on my 18th birthday a few years later, they all came to a sort of daytime party, and my mother looked at them and said, "Who are all these beautiful young people?" She was right.
Southampton girls, mate. Southampton girls, yeah.
Southampton girls, who did the thing with the hair. They had long hair and they could sweep it back.
And it was always shiny. Always shiny. Southampton girls.
Always
so shiny.
Really was. And they were all fabulous people. Bright, brilliant women. Bright, brilliant men. And many of them gone on to do, well, all of them gone to do brilliant things. And I sort of interacted slightly with that school group at that point when he was alive. He took me to one of their parties and all of that sort of stuff. They had a mountaineering group, and Dave was a mountaineer. And one weekend he went off mountaineering. Now, on the Saturday morning, and this was a memory that has absolutely stuck with me, early my mother knocked on my door and said, "There's been an accident involving UCS. It's on Radio 4. There's an emergency number we should call." I remember at the time being absolutely startled that my ma was aware that Dave was on that trip. In retrospect, as a parent, or with hindsight, which way, having grown and become a parent myself, I can kind of see, maybe she'd asked me, "You seeing Dave this weekend?" And I'd said, "No, he's on a mountaineering trip." But she called the number, and at that point, they could say that 2 people on the trip had died. One was a teacher and one was Dave. There were, I think, 9 of them. They were strapped together on lines of 3 on a mountainside in Snowdonia. One came off and brought them all down. And a couple of the boys ran and got help, but as I say, one of the teachers died and Dave died. That's a shocking thing to happen.
So shocking.
Absolutely shocking. And formative for me. In many, many, many ways.
When did you find out he had died? When was the point that you...
Literally that Saturday morning.
Oh,
I think they must have come off the mountainside on the Friday afternoon.
Oh, my God.
And on that Saturday morning, it was reported, the accident was reported on Radio 4. There was an emergency number, and my ma called it and said, "I'm so sorry." And there were a lot of details that I recall. He was a brilliant, bright kid. And the main feeling is that we all moved into adulthood, leaving him behind. Which is, I use the word privilege. We were privileged. We are. We had all had the best education money could buy. That group of people went on into the world to become doctors and lawyers and actors and writers. And I don't know what David would have done. But he didn't get the chance, which is, dreadful. And that's what really, really stays with me, the sense of we left you behind.
Yeah, and that's very common when someone, dies young, and then as you turn the age, you realise, like, well, we're now 17, we're now 18, and you're just leaving them frozen behind. in that childhood, teenage years. Were you? Did you go to the funeral? Was there any kind of ritual that you went to?
Yes, lots and lots of it. And actually, various elements of Jewish ritual kick in. The first is, you may have we've all seen in dramas, Catholic funeral, someone picks up a handful of dust and throws it onto the coffin. The Jewish tradition, the real one, is not that. It is take a shovel and dig. If you are a man over the age of 13, if you've been bar mitzvahed, you do it. And I remember we were around the grave, and it took me by surprise, because I'd never actually been to the one, but for some particular reason, a lot of old Jews get cremated. I don't think I'd actually been to a burial until that point. And I just remember suddenly standing there in this appalling suit that I had, 16-year-old in the suit, being handed the shovel and having to dig large clods of earth.
Wow.
And drop it. And I managed 2 or 3 and then pass the shovel back to the next person. So that's the first thing. The second thing, I always get very emotional about this bit, so I'm going to try and keep it together. Even though it's Griefcast, so you're allowed to.
You're definitely allowed to, yeah.
The other bit of ritual is what's called sitting Shiva. Now, a lot of religious ritual actually has a more social community point, and the point of Shiva is that every night people gather in the house of the deceased to say prayers. What that actually means is that the bereaved are never alone. Traditionally, it would mean that you'd also, the community would gather around, they'd bring food, so that you didn't have to cook, you didn't have to think of anything. When it gets to the much older generation, the grandparents and all of that, people tend to turn up with a box of chocolates, But with David, it was a proper Shiva, and I went to every single night.
Wow.
And I went because I needed to. And all his mates from school were there. And at the end of the first evening, they came up to me and said, "We know you are Dave's closest friend. And now you're ours."
Oh.
It's ridiculous. This is nearly 40 years. And that's what they did. They said, "You're going to be our friend." And they brought me into their social group. And actually what they brought me into was the most amazing social group. And that was what I was bequeathed by David. A new set of friends, a new life, some of whom remain my friends to this day.
Wow.
And I've always been absolutely staggered by that moment. And you can see, as I say, almost 40 years later, it still has this intense impact upon me. Partly, I think, because we tend to project, as parents, we project onto our own kids and imagine them doing something like that as well.
It's a really mature reaction.
Staggeringly mature.
Yeah. For those kids to be in that situation and to reach out, it's touching me because it's so kind in the really truest sense of kind. It's just absolute kindness. There's nothing else in that.
And they meant it. I mean, it wasn't just a line.
No.
It was. Then my phone started ringing. We're going to this place. We're going to that place. Come to this pub with us. That was in the day when you could go to a pub as a 16-year-old. Nobody did check. Come to this party. And they became. Actually, I suddenly realised I'd found the people I wanted to hang out with, so much so that many of the, I keep calling them girls, but women at South Hampstead had assumed that I was at UCS.
Wow.
And I think there was one afternoon when I even went and took part in a debating society thing at school, and even the teachers began to wonder. But they became the focus of my social life. And those people who were involved remained friends for a very long time. They have recently, there's been an attempt to see if I wanted to get involved with memorials to the event. And I've always felt slightly uncomfortable with it because it involves the people who are actually on that mountaineering trip. So some of the I remember very well that, some of those guys who came up to me and said, "You're our friend now," were in plaster casts.
Wow.
Because they had fallen off the mountain with him.
Oh, my God.
Yeah. And just incredibly kind. And it's the kindness that completely kills me. Completely, emotionally destroys me.
It's actions that are so wrapped up in kindness that are so wrapped up in death. Like, it's stuff like that just makes you, like, it overwhelms me of the humanness of it all, of like, you know, we do die and accidents happen and terrible things happen, and then people are so kind and there's so much love, and you realise like that is life, just this, you know, a boy in plaster cast having fallen off a mountain reaching out to you. It's like your brain almost can't take how human that action is, that they were all in pain and they were all in agony.
And I always, you know, I'm not going to claim that we're all still the greatest of friends. We come across each other, Simon, Johnny, Dave, few others, but we all know each other, and I think it's still very much a part of the collective memory. I suspect that's why they have more recently have started talking about an event, raising a glass, talking about it, and getting into it. And I can see exactly why, because, you know, it's an incredibly formative moment. I felt when I was talking about this recently to my other half, is saying the one thing I felt slightly guilty about, you end up having the conversation with yourself, is I did not maintain any contact whatsoever with his family. But then again, Jesus, I was 16.
You're 16. I was just going to say, like, it's
how you know, the mere fact that we processed it together as friends and moved on in life. You know, I also suspect that I'm not sure how much help it would have been.
Yeah.
If all his mates had come and hung around the house with it. I'm sure some of them did, by the way. I'm absolutely certain that a number of them kept contact.
It's so my dad died when I was 15, and, you know, I've had guilt feelings of various things, and I think as you get older, it's so much easier, especially as you said, you know, as you see teenagers, especially, you know, your children are that age, you start seeing them and go, oh, these are children, these are not adults. But when it happens to you, when you are the 16-year-old, you're like, I'm an adult, I know everything.
The conversations, and I don't even look back on them in any way and think, oh, but we were children. Well, I sort of do, because I have my own. But actually, I remember it all as extremely adult. Extremely adult. Maybe we're all thrust into adulthood a damn sight earlier than we should have been.
I guess what I mean,
year that year, actually, 83. I was also thrown out of school for getting stoned at a party, and for 4 months, and it ended up on the front pages of all the papers.
Oh my god!
Oh yeah, quite the year,
quite the formative year. Yeah. I guess what I mean is, like you said, the fact that you didn't, like, I think when you're a teenager and you're grieving, there's only so much you can gather on your plate, in a way. Speaking of food. And it's like, then, like you said, going to see the family and that, like, you're processing it as a teenager with the other teenage boys who you can really relate to, and it must have been so awful for that family, just absolutely awful. Yeah,
I mean, there is nothing worse than the loss of a child.
No,
you should not be predeceased by your child, and it is, as a parent, the great, you know, even if there's no particular reason, you know, these days. Both my boys are in their rooms, been through lockdown. It's you know, it's hardly likely they're even going to get on the road. But you know, obviously you think about it, and I wonder if the intensity of those feelings is amplified by age. By seeing your own kids get to that particular point. The one other thing is, I can't really watch dramas about mountaineering and people falling off mountains.
Oh god, of course.
And it destroys me that every bloody winter, not this one, funnily enough, but every winter, because there is a climbing season, February, March, people die on mountains in Snowdonia. It still happens. And realistically, you know, if you look at mortality rates, it's not something that you can go, don't climb mountains. But I would have had a hell of a problem if either of my boys had wanted to. I would have found that very complicated and would have had to let them do it. But I would have found that very, very complicated. As I say, there have been a couple of movies set in mountaineering, which I've started watching and gone, nope, can't do this. Not going to happen.
It's too close, isn't it? I think there's things, because of course, when, you know, if you haven't experienced, it is a very specific, niche, tragic death to have experienced so young. So if you haven't been through that, you're just watching a mountaineering film, aren't you? Like, oh wow, oh gosh, what's going to happen? But yeah, those things that I was very much like that after my dad died. Anything that was like sort of American Hallmark movie about like cancer, you know, I'd just be like, can't do it, off immediately.
There's so much of it,
and there is so much of it, and often things start and you don't realise, you know what I mean? You're like, oh, this is just about, oh wait, one of them's got cancer. Welcome back to Griefcast with Carrie Adloyd. So what, you were all teenagers. How did you process it as teenage young men at that time?
I think in reality, for me, remember, I cannot speak for the guys who were on the actual trip, who I imagine had any number of levels of PTSD of some kind.
Gotcha.
We haven't actually talked about it, whether they had to deal with it or whatever. I moved on in life pretty quickly. And maybe I blanked it out.
Yeah.
Except that, I'd been bequeathed this entire new social life. Brilliant social life. With great kids and great parties, and, we were all skinning up joints like, there was no tomorrow. So I suspect I blanked it out and moved on very quickly. And I remember that period as being incredibly intense, socially and in terms of who I was and what was going on in my life.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because we're all of you filling that space. You know what I mean? By getting stoned and partying and like social.
Well, I don't even know if that's the case. I mean, it would be nice to say, and then to dull the pain inside, we all went off and got stoned.
But I don't think that.
I think we were just teenagers. Honestly, cannot speak for the kids who were on the trip.
No.
And I say that again. But I think we were just teenagers. But I am struck, that there was no therapy. My parents checked in on me. I don't think I didn't really have any excuses for, when I started getting really quite stoned. I was quite good at smoking dope in those days. I stopped in my first year in university. My entire narcotic career took place between the age of 14 and 18. But even then, it was an ongoing thing, and I don't think I could even say, I was grieving, and that was all. It was connected. No, it's just me. But as I say, in later life, I've had this overwhelming sense of what would Dave have become. Would we still have been friends? It's quite hard to hold on to very old friendships.
Yeah.
People talk about it in a romantic sort of way, and I have some old friends, but when you get to my age, someone who's you've been your friend for 30 years means you knew them when you were in your mid-20s. I'm making myself sound like Methuselah, which I'm not. I'm 54. But yeah, holding them to those from all the way back. It's an interesting one. And there will be, when this goes out, I'll send a note to various people and say, I talked about this and I seem to have got rather emotional, so have a listen.
Did you find that when you got to uni, was there moments where you remembered him, or was it just sort of periodically?
I think I have remembered him periodically all the way through.
Yeah.
But more intensely now. And more intensely now, partly because it's clear my very old mates have remembered him and are dwelling on this a little bit, or at least that they are wanting to get together. And I'm not sure why I'm resistant, but I am. I'm not going, yes, please.
Yeah. What is it? Do you think it's something that you find it's personal? You don't want to do it in a group, or?
I did always have this strong feeling that I wasn't there, and they were, and I can't imagine what that was like.
Yeah.
I've had descriptions, because he lived for a little while after the fall, and I've had descriptions of that. And I think because I wasn't there, that maybe I feel slight fraud, which is wrong, because I lost a, extremely close friend, someone I would spend most weekends with for years. So I don't know what that's about. Carrie, maybe I should get therapy.
I mean, I'm a big fan. But yeah, I can understand that if you weren't there and they were, and then you also, there's that weird, I suppose, you were at the different school. So then you're that slightly, you're circling, like you said, and then after his death, you're brought into that circle. So yeah, maybe it is, like you said, the memorialising of that is it still like, do you still feel like the satellite in that position? No,
I don't actually. I think actually the circle got a bit broader, particularly as we all then went off to university and circles into I have to say, one of them, I think this is, check my privilege and all of that. This is one of those hilarious stories, which is, I wrote a piece very recently explaining that I'd been diagnosed with osteoarthritis in my right hip and I need a new one. And as this diagnosis was happening, I happened to run into part of the old crew just on Oxford Street, and we were talking about what had happened. He said, "Oh, and did you know that Marcus is now one of the most renowned hip men in the country?" So I made contact with one of my childhood friends when I was 16 or 17 and said, I think I need your services, and he is now my consultant. And there, and I you know, when people talk about connections and money and privilege, I'm right there.
Yeah.
And one of my childhood friends is going to probably at some point stick a knife into me and remove part of my body.
That's what all those school fees were for. All those school fees years and years ago. One day that hip will thank you for this.
Well, yeah, that's what I'm going to get out of it, a hip.
Well, after this such a shocking, tragic incident to go through, how do you feel it? Like you said, it affected you. It was profound. Like, when you got to university, did you feel like you had been through something that other people hadn't been through, or?
I certainly felt that I had life experience. Yes. I felt that something had happened that was significant in my life. Actually, another thing that happened that year, and it does all compartmentalised. I passed my driving test. Very shortly afterwards, drove the family car into a lamppost at 55 miles an hour. I know, and should have died but didn't because I was in a Volvo. That's just the case. It's not an advert for Volvo. In those days, I remember the man coming out the house on this corner and saying, "Oh, you're lucky you're in a Volvo. Jesus. Volvo or Rover. Those are the only two cars that would survive that." Wow. And I had the first letter of the license plate on my wall.
Wow.
It had come off as a kind of reminder. And I think one of the things of being that age is the sense of immortality. When you are 16, 17, 18, when you're at university, you're 19, 20, whatever, you think, I am immortal, I can do anything. I think I had a sense of mortality. But I think my approach to that was, to suck the marrow bone from the marrow from the thigh bone of life. I went for it. Yeah. And not in a, as I said, I gave up all the narcotics at 18 after taking too many mushrooms. All of this is described, most of this is described in my latest book, My Last Supper, some of it. If you want further detail on my terrible magic mushroom trip. Yeah. But I did grab life by the scruff of the neck and had a kind of sense of being in a hurry. I'd chosen the university because it had the biggest student newspaper in the country and an editorship, which was a full-time job. You had to be elected to it by a cross-campus vote. And I was concerned that, rather precociously, that I wanted to be a journalist. And I feared people thinking I would get into if I made it, that I got there through nepotism, because my mother was a famous journalist. And so I thought, go to this university, get elected editor, and nobody can question it because students are the most cynical people there are. So if you've been elected by a cross-campus vote, you're fine. And it's a very precocious plan to have when you're 16 or 17.
Yeah.
And it's exactly what happened. It's exactly what I did. I went there and I did work my way through the student paper, and I did become editor, and that was my entree. I have to say, even now, even though my dear mother has died over 10 years ago, I'm still accused of getting where I am through nepotism, which is extraordinary to me. And it took me a while to come up with the line, which was, Claire Rayner was a sex advice columnist in Agony Aunt. And I always say, I have no idea why having a mother who was an expert in premature ejaculation should get you a job on MasterChef. I just don't know. But it took me years to come up with that line.
It's good. It's good. I like it.
But if I look at my approach, there was an urgency. There was an absolute urgency to grab things. And eventually, it did all cascade in on itself. I don't use the word breakdown, but I did, towards the end of the first term of being the editor, I did suffer a significant depressive episode. Ended up on the antidepressives. And certainly my old mum's view was that I was suffering from massive amounts of stress and that I hadn't stopped. That I'd gone through being a student, furiously into drama, into plays, but also into being an editor. So I was first features editor, then the news editor, and then fought an election, then got my degree. I didn't stop, just went straight into editing a paper. Wow. No years out, whatever. I was the editor. I was in my 20s. I was 20 at the point when I finally became the editor. And then all of that piled in. And in retrospect, I do wonder whether that urgency, that requirement to just get
to live
going, to live was motivated in part, in some deeper sense, by this feeling that, you know, life is not necessarily guaranteed.
Yeah, I think that's the thing with when you have an experience like that young. It's hard to say, you know, you can't. I don't think you can draw straight lines and be like, oh, it was this, and I did this, and then this.
No.
But it, like, certainly it's like it gets into your cells, doesn't it? Of like this knowledge. I think it's a human of like, oh, there's not much time. Oh, right, I've really seen that up close. I can't ignore it.
I mean, one of the things I should also say is, I have written fiction. I published 4 novels. And I'm a writer, and even as a writer of non-fiction, one of the things non-fiction writers don't really admit to is that we have a habit of straightening narratives into neat, tidy lines. We're very good at it.
Currently writing a book, feeling like very seen. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
We redirect the world into the tidy lines.
We love
like.
a narrative. We love it.
We love a narrative, and so a narrative which says, "I went to university." And I did everything and touched everything and finally, you know, worked myself into a depressive illness through stress because when I was 16, my best friend fell off a mountain and died. It's very tidy.
Yeah, it's tidy.
Very neat.
Yeah.
And so even while I say it out loud, I also wonder if I'm being a bit facile and trite. Yeah,
I know. I mean, I'm obsessed with narrative, and I'm obsessed with...
Are you writing fiction or non-fiction?
I'm writing non-fiction about grief, about death and grief. And we talk a lot about on the show. I think that narrative can be really helpful for grief because I think sometimes happens is people don't have a narrative, and so they can't put things together. And I think it can be really helpful to just give them a narrative, like, this is when the death happened, this is how you felt, this is why. And I think often grief throws narrative everywhere. It's just like splatters the paint everywhere, and so you can't see anything. And that's what I think they mean by time heals. What they mean is the further you're away from all the paint splatter, you can be like, oh, I see, actually, yes, all these things are connected.
Narratives are great, and even if they're false.
Yeah, they're helpful. It's like placebos, isn't
they're
it?
ours. It doesn't really matter.
No, but you're right. You can't. It would be facile to just be like, oh, that's the reason this happened.
Yeah, you know, my parents' deaths were very very straightforward in certain ways. They weren't necessarily tidy, but they were very straightforward. I can tell lots of stories about them. And I quite enjoy those stories because it's about 2 people who reach the end of their lives. My mother would dearly have liked to live a bit longer. She died at 79, but though, frankly, given some of her pathologies, that was good going. And my dad made it to 85, and I think he'd lived on as long as he really wanted to without her. And there are narratives there, but I don't feel the need to create stories around that. They're very manageable and they're great.
Yeah, it's interesting.
They work.
When I was talking to Philippa Perry, actually, and she was talking about her father's death, and we were, again, sort of getting into narrative, and I think, like you said, that a lot of the need for narrative comes when there is... Not complicated grief is a technical term. I don't mean that. I mean, like you said, when things happen in the wrong order, or it's a shock, or it's, you know, it's a very traumatic death. And then I think narrative, because then it's chaos. Whereas I think a parent dying, as you said, when you're at a reasonable age for a parent to die, they're at a reason, but it's not you know, it doesn't mean you're not weeping for joy. It's sad, but it's not a terrible shock, I think, is the key.
It's not a terrible shock. There's also something else. I did communicate with a very close friend of mine who recently lost a parent, and I'd known that it had been going on for a very long time, and I sent her a text to say, look, I'm really sorry, your old mum's gone, and here's something very few people are allowed to tell you. You're also allowed to feel relief.
Yeah. Because
when a very ill, sick parent dies, you can feel relieved. It's over.
Yeah.
And I've always said, because at one point, because both my parents, I'm not sure why this was, but I think I both my parents died. I hate some of the euphemistic language around death. Both my parents died within a relatively short period, and I felt like I'd been through it. And the one thing I've always said is, the dying is the worst. Having died is much easier.
Yeah, the act of it.
Yeah. The whole process leading up, the will they, won't they, the drama, the narrative, and all of that stuff is hard to deal with. Once they've gone, that's much easier to deal with. But obviously, with David, it's a totally different thing.
Yeah, completely different.
I spoke to him on the phone on a Thursday, went off on a mountaineering trip on a Friday, and then he was dead.
Yeah.
And I never spoke to him again. And then lots of other things happened. And then the death is the thing that you have to deal with.
Yeah, I think especially when it comes to accidents and tragic accidents and something very shocking, just something really, really shocking. And that's when I think narrative is magical, because it can bring you out of the shock and ground you back down and be like, I see, this was the beginning, this was the middle, this was the end. Okay, that's what happened to me. Because I think so much part of shock is what just happened, I don't understand. But yeah, I think the relief is, we talk about that a lot on the show, of like, of course, if someone's in pain and now they're not in pain, how is that not a relief? How, like, if you love them and they're not in agony anymore, and again, it doesn't mean you're oh, brilliant, they died, I'm so happy, but I'm glad they're out of that situation.
There's something else to be said, and it's relevant to COVID, actually, and it's a quiet conversation that I think people of my age whose parents have died tend to have, which is, it can also be liberating. When you get, the last thing I would ever wish for you is your father dying at 15. That's terrible. There's a whole psychodrama over there in the corner, which I'm hoping the book is really helping, or just doing this every few days. But when you get to a certain point, when you're a middle-aged person, and they've both gone, and you love them dearly, but they're no longer there, there is something liberating. You move on to life. And both my wife and myself, parents have gone. And we both agreed, as COVID happened, thank Christ they're not here. Because this would have been an utter nightmare. Yeah. And I know it has been an utter nightmare for people with elderly parents, and managing the isolation of an elderly parent that you care about very much, that you can't see, and you can't take the grandparents around, and all of that sort of stuff. And then you're worrying about comorbidities and all the illnesses they already have, and all of that stuff. And that's what's going to carry them off. And no, I haven't had to have any of that.
We've had the same comment. My husband...
Can I just say, by the way, my parents would be in their 90s now if they were still alive. So it's not like I'm delighted. Hey, they would have been very, very old.
Yeah, no, and my husband's lost both his mum and his dad, and we had the same conversation of, I think everyone is having. You look and you think, God, like, how would we have coped? Because they would have been in their 80s and they lived, very remotely, and all of these things you can't help but be like, oh, thank God we're not having to deal with that. And for those people who are, obviously your heart goes out to them, because this is, having an elderly parent anyway is a stressful, anxious, anxiety-inducing situation, and what we're dealing with now is an insanity, a complete tragic insanity that no one's ever dealt with before. I'm just wondering, in these COVID times, how you feel about your own mortality. Like, how do you said as you're younger, like, you burnt and you lived, like, how now you have reached a grand old age, not Methuselah, but it's not, it's 54. Not bad, 54. Like, how do you feel now? Is it something you worry about, or not really?
Well, I do have cause to. A very, very dear friend of mine died only a couple of years ago at roughly my age, cancer. And that brings it home to you. As this disease, floated around, it became very clear to me very quickly that large men are high up the list. I don't have any other underlying issues, no diabetes, no heart blood pressure, and I am I'm going to do this shamelessly. There's an exercise bike.
You got the exercise. Good work.
I've got the Apex. I have a very hefty gym habit, so I'm fit, but it was very much in my mind that there is a risk. It still is. I mean, really annoyingly, my wife, who's 4 years older than me, she's had the jab. I haven't. I'm still waiting.
Oh no! They said they start in over 40s. You should have been done by now.
Well, I mean, at what point are you allowed? They did, I seem to recall, at one point say, if you're over 70 and haven't had the call, please get in contact. Right, yeah. So I'm waiting for that shout. But I am mildly resentful.
That's fair enough.
But yeah, I have I have life insurance. So should I die over the next few years, my family would be properly provided. They'll be fine anyway, but there'll be a lump sum.
Yeah.
I've thought of all of those things, and it has been very real, actually. I'm not keen on dying yet. I've quite got a lot of things I want to get done.
Yeah. You've still got that burning, I feel. It's still like, there's still like, there's stuff to be done. There's stuff to be done.
There's stuff to be done, and I like life. I like, sorry, it's a statement of the obvious. But I'm not sanguine about it at all. I'd be livid, absolutely livid. So, yeah, I'm aware of it. I'm very conscious of it. And this is the point when you get into your 50s that you start hearing, of friends dying of cancers and things like that. It just happens.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
It's infuriating.
Yeah, it's strange. As someone who lost a parent very young, I suppose
How old was he?
He was 44, which is why I think 54 is a pretty good age. So I'm like, oh, 54.
Well, what you would have done to get for another 10 years of him,
yeah. So
I'm
to
sure.
me, like I have a complete, and it's it's rare. It's rare for someone to die at that age. He died of pancreatic cancer, which is the fifth most common cause of cancer. But not for someone to be a teenager and lose a parent, it is unusual, inverted commas. Obviously, it happens. And so what I'm trying to say is like my parameters are completely skewed. So when I meet people and they say, oh gosh, oh, you know what it's like, you get into your 50s and our parents are dying, and I'm like, what do you mean you get into your 50s and parents are dying? Like, my sense of it's completely warped. So I'm in my late 30s, and I'm reaching the age where some of my friends are starting to lose parents. And and the shock of it, and being like, oh gosh, I never realised. And it's just, we say on the show all the time, like, I just got to the club early. So that's the thing. And I wonder, like you said with David, and you just become aware that things can happen. I
definitely got in a sense, I got to the club very early.
Yeah.
Because the significant thing is that the bond I had with David was one of pure friendship. Yeah. He was a mate, a proper mate. And for a mate to die when you're 16...
Yeah. That's mad.
Just rude.
It's rude. It's rude. I totally agree with you.
It's wrong.
Yeah.
And I have a tendency to flippancy to get the laugh. So I just want to be absolutely clear. I grieve for his parents and his sister and wonder the impact on them. It was a monumental event in everybody's life. But we have, as a group, gone on, ignore me, they've gone on to do remarkable things. Great group of people.
But like you said, it's life and death all wrapped up together. There's this wonderfulness that happens, these brilliant people. Then, of course, you can't help but think about him and what he would have done and all of those things. And like you said, there's, we can romanticize that narrative, and who knows. And I have it with my dad as well. It's easy to be like, oh, if he had 10 more years, but also like, he could have had 10 more years and we could have had a huge fallout and never spoke. Like, who knows? Yeah. So you kind of have to...
we are allowed to be in charge of our own imaginary narrative. We're allowed to do that.
Yeah, that's true.
And I am more than allowed. He was bright. He would have got great A levels. He may have gone to Oxbridge. Still can't say what he might have done. It's a bit weird that I can't say, and he was definitely destined to be an X or a Y.
I guess at 16, like, not many kids do know. Obviously, you clearly had this journalist path.
I did, and I knew I was slightly peculiar in that regard. It was already clear in my head that was what was going to happen. That was partly, I have to say, because I'd worked out. Up to that point, I thought I was going to be an actor, and then I realised that an ability to remember lines and show off was not the same thing.
So many people never reach that conclusion, Jay.
What, people who are in the business?
Yes.
I've got a... Yeah, I mean, do you know, the funny thing is, this is completely off topic, but I have quite a few friends who are actors and very successful, some of them. Very successful indeed. And the older they get, the more suspicious they seem to become of what they do for a living.
Yeah.
I've had conversation. I'm talking about people who played leads for the RSC, who've been in big Hollywood movies. And I said, so what are you up to? And they went, oh, pretending.
I just want to ask just one last question before we finish. So just because I think maybe it's useful for future. At your funeral, have you thought about what food should be served?
I'm really annoying on this,
okay.
Gary.
You don't care?
I don't care.
I don't care at all.
I don't care at all.
But what don't you see?
I mean, look,
so many people say this. I'm like, but for your family who are then planning, going, what should we serve? Like, is there one
It's
thing?
their fucking problem. I'm dead. Do you know? Here's a hilarious thing. One of the story. My mother, at one point towards the end of her life, got quite exuberant with her funeral plans.
Right.
And she would say, at one point she said, I want my body left in a wood. I want to be drawn in a horse-drawn carriage, plumed carriage. I want this, I want that. And I remember getting a phone call from, I think it was the Daily Mail after Claire had gone, saying, we understand that your mother would like to be left in a wood. And I said, look, mate, the thing is, she changed it all the time. She loved fantasizing about her own funeral. So we really haven't decided. And anyway, she's gone. It's up to us. Yeah. And I feel exactly. Okay. Yeah, but for what it's worth, it was a very simple wicker basket, and through the crematorium at Butchie, and it was all fine. Golders Green, rather. So no, I'm sorry, but I genuinely, I'm a headbanging atheist. There is no God, as far as I'm concerned. So when I've gone, I mean, I'd like to imagine it would be full of people weeping and wailing, and maybe, mysterious women throwing red roses onto my coffin and swanning out. It's not going to be like that, but
no, that's
but that's a fantasy for the living. No, I have absolutely
no. Jay, thank you so much for talking to me. It was really, really lovely, and thank you for remembering David today as well, because I feel like we did that as well. So
I think we did that properly.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
You can follow Jay on Twitter at jrayner1, JAYRAYNER1. You can follow us on Twitter and Instagram at The Griefcast. The show was edited by Kate Holland. Music was provided by The Glue Ensemble. Someone said I say it so quick they never heard. It's The Glue Ensemble. You can buy their music if you head to theglueensemble.com. And was recorded in lockdown from my living room and Jay's office, I think. Thank you so much for listening. And remember, you are not alone.
Hey there, podcast pet parents. It's Dory from Forever 35. You've got plenty to do and don't need more to worry about, especially when it comes to your pets. So try Wondercide, a spray that kills and repels 100% of fleas and ticks and replaces spot drops or pills. Wondercide is a safe, plant-based, effective spray. And because it's plant-based, it's safer on kids and can be used on dogs and cats of all ages. It also smells amazing. We sprayed my dog with the lemongrass flea and tick spray, and he actually smells good for once. Try Wondercide flea and tick spray for 20% off at wondercide.com/podcast, and make sure to use code podcast at checkout. Again, that's Wondercide, WONDERCIDE, wondercide.com/podcast.